Whether it's a condo, HOA, or apartment building, security is always a concern in multifamily settings. This seminar will discuss privacy laws as they intersect with boards and owners' responsibilities, the use of surveillance technologies, proper training for staff members, and the importance of doing an accurate, realistic assessment of your property's security needs. To help discuss these topics, I have a panel of experts here that I'd like to introduce to you. First, we have Bill Chatt of Cervantes, Chatt and Prince. Bill is a partner in the law firm and specializes in community association law. His firm handles several hundred associations throughout Chicago, and Bill is also a frequent speaker and writer on issues pertaining to condo law. Next to Bill, we have Gene Weiskopf, president of Admiral Security Services. Admiral has been providing security staffing since the late 60s, and they are Chicago's only security company that focuses on residential communities. And next to Gene, we have Brent Stradoff of TriView Property Management. Gene is co-owner and founder of TriView, and his company manages over 125 associations from the South Loop to Rogers Park. In addition, TriView also manages over 1,000 rental issues. So the format for today's program is I have a series of questions that I'll be asking our panel, and they'll be discussing those questions. And then I'll leave 10 or 15 minutes open at the end of the seminar for Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, hold them until the end, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So our first question that we have is for Bill Chatt. Bill, briefly discuss the legal definitions of privacy that apply in a multifamily residential setting. Talk about things like physical access to units, surveillance, informational privacy, etc.
Thank you. As far as the term privacy, you're not going to see it either in the condo or the SECA Acts as to a definition that necessarily pertains to association living. As far as a working definition, probably the best place to start is almost constitutional law, the federal constitution, and what is the expectation of privacy. And just for a second, I'll kind of jaunt off to a somewhat unrelated area. A great example of expectation of privacy is if you're at home and you discard something in your garbage, you put it in a garbage bag, it ends up on the curb, and let's say the government's monitoring you for some criminal activity. Before the garbage man gets there, they grab your garbage bags, take it back, find some incriminating evidence, and then use that to prosecute you. You never had an expectation of privacy in your garbage, so that was a lawful thing for the government to do. That's kind of probably the best place to start. What's the expectation of privacy? So when you're talking about associations, actually, from a legal perspective, it's a rather straightforward issue. I can tell you there's no case law that I know of in Illinois regarding privacy cases, but I do deal with them in association representation. What's the expectation of privacy when you're living in a condo or a community association? You probably don't have an expectation of privacy when you pull into the general parking lot of your association. You shouldn't have a expectation of privacy when you're walking through the hallway to the stairs or to the elevator, or when you're in the vestibule getting the mail. You probably don't have an expectation of privacy if you're in a townhome association when you're walking the grounds in the streets and things like that. It's when you get into your unit that you have your expectation of privacy. So, like I said, I think it's a relatively simple issue. I think the expectation starts within your unit. But trying to balance security versus privacy, I think when you're dealing with an association, cameras in the vestibule or at the entrances of townhome associations, things like that. That I think is something that's not a real controversial issue. I think that the associations can do that. My best advice is to always openly let your unit owners know or your homeowners know what's going on with cameras and things like that. I always find that this is a much easier dialogue when you've had some criminal activity on the grounds. A few people get their units broken into or have their cars broken into, everyone wants cameras. When you live in a relatively safe area, it might be a little more subject to debate about, do we really need them and the like. But as long as the cameras are monitoring common areas, I really don't think that unit owners have much of a gripe. Now, where the area starts getting gray is when the camera is down on a common area, but maybe it's catching some balconies or things like that. I don't think you have an expectation of privacy in a condominium building, if you're all sitting in your balconies, it's one of those things. Again, there hasn't been a judge that's told me otherwise. So if the camera happens to be catching the balconies, because it's monitoring a primarily common area, so be it. Obviously, if the camera is, facing into someone's window or something like that, then it gets pretty easy. And I don't think you need a lawyer to tell you that's probably wrong. So as far as the camera issue and privacy, that's my 2 cents on that. Access to units. This is kind of a funny one because I think just about every declaration that I read says, oh, in the event of an emergency, let me back up. The association where it needs to work on common elements or troubleshoot an issue, it does have a right to access a unit. Let's say you're a snowbird, you're down in Florida, and we hear water, and we see water coming through your door. We pretty much have a right to access the unit to stave off an emergency. That said, when we do have that issue come up, that is one of the ones where we sit there and scratch our heads and go, what kind of emergency is this? Is this really an emergency? Because it's one of those things where, as much as I live and die by the black and white writing of your declaration, if I have to go to court, I have to feel comfortable that I can tell a judge that, yeah, this is what was going on. So it's one of those things where it's in most of your declarations probably, but where if you call me, you're going to hear me say one thing one day and one thing another, depending on what the emergency is. We have ones, it's not so much an issue now, but going back 7-8 years ago when we had foreclosures and banks had units and no one's going in there and it's like, we don't know what's going on, winter's coming and things like that. Especially in the instance of banks, I hope no one works for a bank here, I'd say go into the unit. Those are the ones because they were pretty much hands-off owners anyway. And it's not like we're going in for any purpose other than maybe to turn off water or to deal with a vermin issue or something like that. But as far as access to units go, it's definitely a case-by-case basis, and it's one of those things where you are better off consulting with counsel. I mean, I had a personal experience with my own 85-year-old mother. Someone was trying to get into her unit, and sometimes I go, Mom, are you really sure? And she's like, no, they got into the unit. What it was the people across the way were doing some remodeling, and the trim was really long, so they didn't want to bend the trim. So I actually got the property manager to open my mom's unit without calling her, without even knocking on the door. Scared the living bejesus out of her. She's 85, she's got a heart condition. Good thing nothing happened because I was ticked off as it was, but that is not an instance when you have a right to access. That's where you call and say, hey, would it be okay? Things like that. It's like I say, you hear a whooshing gas noise, you see water coming out, you got a vermin issue, things like that. To the extent you have, if you have a unit owner standing down saying, I will not let you into the unit, even if it's an instance where I think you have the right to it, we got to go to court and get an injunction and get an order. And we do have those cases. It's crazy. Someone's got a unit where there's leaking above, leaking below, and they're going to stand on principle. You can't get in. Well, there's better things to stand on principle on, whether it's that or something else. But so we do have that. What was the other one? Access to informational. Yeah, that's one thing that's kind of coming up. People setting up. It's one thing for the association to have a Facebook page or a web page. It's another thing for some dissident owners who are mad with the association to set up their own one in the same name and post information. That gets a little silly, but we've seen that happen where people will essentially paraphrase the association name, and then people get confused, and they use it as a forum to blast the board or whatever. When it comes to stuff like that, as a board member, it's a thankless job, and people don't like you the minute you're elected, as it is. But when people do things, they better be careful, because if it's incorrect, you could run into things like defamation or things like that. I can't control what non-board members, I can't control what board members do either at the end of the day, but I can't certainly control what non-board members do if they're going to set things up like that. Freedom of speech and all that. Yeah. Well, freedom of speech has its limits too. So if you're going to say things that are defamatory or untrue, the board does have a right to do certain things. But my thinking with that is, try to have a bit of a thick skin with that stuff, because it's always going to happen. It's not worth running into court every time someone says something you don't like. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Bill. Our next question is for Gene Weisskopf of Admiral Security. Gene, what are the most common security-related questions and concerns you get from multifamily clients, and how do you address them?
Hi, good morning. So what we do is we actually provide staff on site. We don't provide any cameras. So when we're talking with associations and boards, we're dealing with buildings that already either have a security staff or a door staff in place, or are looking to implement a security staff or door staff. These tend to be the larger buildings, mostly in the downtown city area, not so much in the suburbs. So when we're talking with them, usually the biggest question is what's your recruiting? That's first and foremost. Where are you getting people? How are you getting them? There's no magic bullet in finding people. I think anyone who's done any sort of hiring knows that it's not necessarily where you find them. It's how you interview and what you're looking for. We, in general, are because we only work in multifamily residential communities. That's our entire business. We're not hiring security guards. We're hiring door staff, concierge, or security guards who have a residential bent. So we're looking for customer service because that's what works in the residential world. Security is obviously important. That's why we're here. But customer service is just as important. So we're looking to recruit people who have the ability to do both, who can say hello to you and open the door, but also know who belongs in the building and who doesn't, to keep an eye on the contractor who might not look like they belong here, make sure that nobody's trailing in behind the resident, and just trying to sneak in pretending they're with them. So it's a balance trying to find those folks. The next thing is training. Again, if you have a security or door staff, training is key. Just putting somebody in a uniform and letting them sit by the front door isn't enough. They need to know what to look for. You need to have some experience in understanding what is appropriate for somebody in security and what isn't. They are not police officers. They're not pseudo police officers, not rent-a-cops. They don't have any arrest authority. They shouldn't be getting involved in physical disputes or trying to break up physical disputes. Some boards and associations think that that's what they're supposed to do. If there's a fight in the lobby, they're supposed to jump in and karate chop people to stop, and that's not what they're there for. And then sort of the third, well, actually there's four. The third thing is supervision. How is your staff being supervised? There are lots of associations that have their own in-house staff, and while that's all well and good, who's supervising them? Is it the board that's supervising them? Is it the resident? Is it the other residents that supervise it? The property manager? You'll say, oh, the property manager supervises them. Well, the property manager's there typically Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Who's supervising the door person or security guard at night or on the weekends? And the answer generally is nobody. So you need to figure out who's in charge and who do they respond to if there's an emergency. There needs to be clear training on that. And then the last question that we typically get is there's an issue with a certain resident. I think everybody's familiar with that. Either they're trouble for one reason or another. They have parties. Maybe there's suspected drug use or what have you. There's a million things you can think of. And they want to know, can you specifically watch the resident in unit 1101? And the answer generally is no, we can't discriminate. We can't, target people. That's not what we're here for. We'll keep an eye on what's going on in the entire building. But once you start sort of targeting people, you open up a can of worms, and I think everyone is pretty well aware of it. But it doesn't stop associations, good-hearted, well-intended associations from saying, well, this person's got visitors at all hours of the night. We want to stop that. Can you stop them from having visitors? And the answer is no. So that's something that a lot of associations do want to know about, and they do want to do. And sort of caution you, don't do it because you're heading down a road that it's going to end you up in a lawsuit.
Thank you very much, Gene. Our next question is for Brent Stradoff of Triview Property Management. And Brent, the Chicagoland Cooperator, I hope you all read our monthly newspaper, We get a lot of questions from readers involving the placement and monitoring of security cameras in common areas. What can you tell us about proper versus improper placement, storage, and access to recorded footage, and the value of even having cameras at all?
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate it. Once again, my name is Brent Stradiff. Good afternoon, everybody. So there's a few different types of communities. There's, the communities that don't employ door staff and things of that nature, and there's the communities that do employ door staff. So communities that have door staff, they're almost 100% of the time going to have a security type of camera and system. And that's, typically monitored by that person at the front desk to make sure that there's not any suspicious activity happening and things of that nature. And then there's like portfolio type client or properties that don't necessarily have door staff. And those, can and sometimes do have cameras as well. In both circumstances, the placement of those cameras is very similar. You want to have, your cameras, and I'll lean on Gene for this as well, but you want to have your cameras placed in areas where people can enter the building. So whether it's the front door, the side door, the back door, anywhere where there's an entry to the building, there could and there's definitely a reason to have it there. Also, if you're having any sort of issues, like we're placing them in elevators a lot these days because that's to monitor moves and to make sure that if there's damage that's created during the move, we can kind of understand how that happened and who did it. And then in, if particular hallways or rooftop decks and things of that nature, that's a good placement for them as well. So in both circumstances, the placement of the cameras are very similar. If it's, I want to make sure that people have kind of proper expectations of cameras as well. If you are, for instance, living in a, oh yeah, sorry. Can you guys hear me better now? Do you want me to repeat everything I just said? So with cameras, it's important to know that if there's some sort of suspicious activity, the most common is stealing of packages and things of that nature is happening. If it's somebody in the building, cameras really serve a good purpose to identify that person in the building and then be able to submit formal requests, fine them, and possibly take other action with them as well. If it's somebody that is intruding from the outside that doesn't necessarily live in the building, the footage is good because you'll find out how they're entering the building and you can take action to that. But the expectation shouldn't be that you're going to turn this over to the police and they're going to find this person and they're going to arrest them, because that's not going to necessarily happen. But it really serves a good purpose for identifying how they're entering the building, if there is something that can be addressed that's a possible breach, or if it is somebody internally that is doing these things. Those really kind of serve that purpose. Monitoring of the cameras too. The newer cameras are all kind of IP based, which is nice because you can view those cameras anywhere where there's an internet connection. Some of these older systems are a little antiquated, and if it's hey, something happened here on this day, be aware that that could take almost a day in order to go through that footage of the camera as well, because there's not necessarily on some of the older systems a way to kind of fast forward and get there in a really efficient manner. So kind of take those things into consideration. But again, the newer systems are much easier to operate and work with. There's also things like the front door, where some of these new IP systems, anybody with an internet connection can pull up whoever is at the front door on their phone or on their computer simply with that IP address. And there's some buildings that are doing that as well these days. And that's kind of a more affordable type of solution, because if somebody has that IP address and they have their phone handy and somebody does dial up and they want to see who that is, they can see who that person is pretty easily. What other questions did I not address on there?
Let's see. Proper storage, recorded access to recorded footage, and the value of even having cameras.
Yeah. So the access to the footage, I mean, that's important. I mean, if something criminal is happening, that you need to take immediate action in order to gain that footage. And that's not only for possibly the police, but also for the board and possibly the person that was affected so that they can view that. But if you're requesting that footage because something like that happened, I mean, you should be given access to get that footage. But bear in mind that if it's an older system, there may be some challenges that come along with getting that footage as well. So I think
That's good.
thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you very much, Brent. Back to our attorney, Bill Chat, for the next question. And Bill, what are some possible legal consequences for either A, not providing adequate security in a multifamily building, or B, overstepping and violating privacy laws with overzealous, intrusive surveillance?
So it's the classic not doing enough versus doing too much. So in the not doing enough category, again, I think it's a function of the association you're living in. If you've got an association where crime is rampant and there's been multiple break-ins, or there's just so many issues that this is taking over every meeting, and that's where all the complaints to the management company are coming in. That's where you want to be a little more proactive on it. Obviously, the overarching legal issue is fiduciary duty of the board. You're responsible. You're responsible obviously for payment of the bills and getting the grass cut and the snow removal, but you're responsible for the overall management of your association. So if you do have something with crime and things like that, it's something that you should take seriously and work with your management company. And because a management company has lots of examples, they could say, hey, I got another association just like you, and this is how we're handling it. So that's one of the things you want to kind of bring them in on it, and obviously evaluate your options. So to do nothing, you could get a cry of breach of fiduciary duty for not doing it. Now, fiduciary duty suits are really a lot of fun. It's not like there's a litmus test for this. It's all factual and circumstantial, but why even get there? You have the right to levy the assessments to pay for things like this. So that's one of the things you want to make sure if there's major issues that you do it. And even if there isn't, at least discuss it and go through that issue. It's like a checkoff item. To the other end of the continuum, too much. I think Gene was bringing up the example of hey, this one unit owner, we got to watch this one unit owner. That's where you start running into problems. Like we're going to surveil this one unit owner. As far as stuff like that goes, rule violations, finable offenses, they just occur. It's not your job to sit there and prevent them. I was in Scottsdale, Arizona last week, and I was driving through an area, and it said, traffic law is photo enforced. Now, up here, I see that sign all the time, and I totally ignore it unless it's a red light. I mean, these ones where they say speed limit. I have not known anyone to get one of these tickets from one of these cameras. Well, anyway, I was driving down some street in Scottsdale at night, and all of a sudden I saw a big flash of light because this car went flying past me, and apparently they're doing it for real. You violate the speed limit, and this camera goes off, and they're going to get a ticket or whatever. So that whole Big Brother aspect to everything, it's definitely coming to roost. I mean, there's cameras. The city of Chicago has cameras in certain high crime areas where they're just monitoring things. Which on one hand, if you're the kind of person that's not doing anything wrong, you might be offended by it. If you're the guy that just got mugged and they took your wallet, you're hoping they got footage and they can find out who did it. So. To the extent you're focusing on any one person, that's going to be a problem, okay? Like I say, finable offenses and rules violations, they occur. People will be there when they happen. Someone parks in your parking spot, it's going to be pretty easy to go take your phone picture and go, hey, this guy's in my spot. Someone's walking the dog, not picking up after their dog. Those are things like that. To set a camera because you think someone's a habitual offender, now you're starting to kind of go down a path that makes me uncomfortable. Cameras faced at a unit, I would not be a big fan of that. I think people do not have an expectation of have a camera zooming in on their unit only. I've had some associations where we didn't know if it was a unit owner or a board member, but there was kind of a hidden camera. Don't do that. You want to let people know that these areas are being monitored by video. There's nothing wrong with doing it if you're doing it properly, so let people know that. So don't do things in secret, because I've never seen that work out. So it's things like that. I think it's got to be the common area. It's got to affect everyone the same. That's the safe thing. That if I walk through the vestibule, you're as affected as I am. We both walk through that same camera. When it's only in a certain area, that's the other thing too. Oh, this part of the association, okay, well, this part of the association versus the entire association, again, you're kind of separating off one group of people from the other. So that's kind of the, I think the dividing line where you got to be careful.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. A couple more questions for our panel, then we're going to open it up for Q&A from the audience. Our next question is for Gene Weisskopf. Gene, what are the top 3 biggest security-related mistakes or misconceptions you encounter in multifamily buildings?
Well, I think the biggest one is that people seem to forget that the residents themselves play the biggest role in security at your property. Whether that's, high rise, mid rise, townhouse association, what have you. Residents are there 24/7. They live there, they work, some work there, more and more are working at home. And the residents themselves play the biggest role. I mean, it amazes me, I'm in and out of buildings, and I'm sure Brian could probably say the same thing. If you're dressed nicely and you kind of look like you belong, residents will hold the door open for you and let you in. It happens to me all the time, even here in the city. So it's the residents need to, if they don't know who you are and they're not familiar with you, don't let me walk in just because I'm in a suit. Don't let me walk in. Just because you see a contractor, don't assume that they're actually working there. Most people, there's a misconception that most crime happens at night. It's just not true. Most crime happens during the day. Why? Because people are at work and nobody's home. So a lot of associations think, oh, we need to have somebody on the midnight shift because there's, it's dangerous. Well, actually, you really probably need someone there during the day more than the night because A, that's when more crime happens. B, handling packages and theft of packages from Amazon, UPS, etc., has exploded. So a lot of times UPS will just open, they'll throw the packages in the vestibule and they'll keep going. Well, criminals know that, so they're going to come in and they're going to do their Christmas shopping in your lobby. So residents themselves, and again, boards need to beat this into people's head that they are the #1 barrier, preventer of crime in their association. So it means lock your door. For example, we had a situation a month ago where it's a mid-rise here in the near north area. Garage door goes up, guy walks up the garage. There's no camera monitoring that. I'm not sure why, but we had door staff there. They go in, and they were in the garage for an hour because we could see them when they exited. But in that hour, they stole 2 bikes, which happens. But the bigger thing is that somebody left their car door open. They stole the remote to the garage door. 5 hours later, guess what happened? They came back with their friends and they opened the garage door because now they have a remote. And they went in and they stole some more bikes. So how did that even happen? Well, it happened because somebody thought in a high-rise garage that their car was safe and they didn't lock their door. So had they locked their door, they could never have gotten back in. So it's incumbent upon you as board members to reinforce to your residents. That's #1, #2, #3, #4 on things that you need to do. The second thing, cameras. We talked a lot about cameras. Cameras don't solve all problems. Cameras just show you what happened after the fact. And a lot of times in smaller associations, nobody's watching the cameras, nobody's monitoring the cameras, and nobody even looks at them until it's too late. So as Brent said, they'll show you how people got in. But, okay, that's great, but that might happen a week later. The second thing about cameras is if you've not upgraded your cameras in the last 3, 4, 5 years, you need to do it. It's like any technology. It's cheaper and cheaper. It's better and better. If you're still using, I've run into associations that still have VCR tapes, and they're changing tapes out, and it's a disaster. You might as well just throw it away. You can't see anything. The resolution's terrible. Spend the money. It's worth it. Buy new cameras. Buy cameras in color. Buy digital. Get them online. The investment's well worth it. And lastly is that with regards to staffing itself, there's the old adage, you get what you pay for is never more true because you're paying for people's time when you're hiring a company like ours. So if you're going out and you're like, well, we're going to get the low bidder, well, guess what? You're also getting people who are generally making the least amount. So you're getting the sort of the least qualified staff. So if you're the bill, if the company's going to bill you $20 an hour, they're going to pay their people, I don't know, $14 an hour, just as an example. If they're going to bill you 19, well, now they're paying 13, roughly. And so, as people say, well, we're just going to take the low bidder, it's like, well, you get what you pay for, just like anything else. So if you're looking for staff that's reliable, you're looking for high quality staff, the low bid in this particular case, because it's not is sort of, I think, wasted. You're sort of paying something, but you're not paying what you should be paying. If you're looking at the same model computer, and that's apples to apples, well, yeah, of course you'd pay for the same thing. But when you're paying for people's time, it's like getting a discount dentist. You don't really want a discount dentist. Yeah, they're going to do the dental work, but who knows how it's going to be. So.
Okay, one final question for our property manager, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. And Brent, our last question is, as a management professional, how do you balance a board's desire for extensive and advanced security technology with their actual real-world needs?
Thank you. So I just want to reiterate kind of what Gene said too, is in his points 1, 2, 3, and 4 is security is everybody's responsibility. And when you can take that mentality, you're going to have a more peaceful environment that you're living in. In terms of balancing, security and community, that's tough because you could take any community and you could lock it down like Fort Knox, and there's a trade-off with that. And does that trade-off make sense for your community, and what type of community do you want? Because yes, you may feel more secure, but there's also things that kind of, with that security, it's more inconvenient. It's more inconvenient to enter the building. It's more convenient to come and go. And there could be other things. So you want to have that balance. And what's important is to find out what that balance is with your community. And that is discussing these type of situations at board meetings. What are you looking for out of the community in terms of security? What is a good balance? Sending out surveys is another good thing to kind of find out what people are looking for and what they need. But getting that involvement and understanding what type of community the board and residents want to have is key, because making some assumptions that on either end of the spectrum, that saying that we want all of this really intense security to make sure nothing happens, and then vice versa, not having enough. You've got to find out what those needs are or what those wants are of the community. So forums and surveys and things like that are important to create that balance.